My name is Ken Carter. It is an absolute delight and a pleasure for me to make this sort of homecoming. CITI has affected everything in my career for the last 30 years. In September of 1996, Monroe Price placed me in an internship working for Ellie as part of the telecoms workshop. Alex was then the associate director. Rosa was an intern. Rosa, it is so nice to see you all grown up and erudite and just one of us deep thinking eggheads. It's wonderful. So I did some research on universal service. I drafted a presentation for Ellie to make to the Japan Society on the future of television. And on my last day as an intern working for Ellie as a law student, I produced this slide. So it is great moments in communications history, and Ellie Noam is there to publish. So needless to say, I was invited back. When Alex left to go to business school, Ellie hired me to be Alex's replacement as his associate director. I worked for 2 years. We got a Sloan grant. We published any number of books and papers and conferences. We put together the first distance education course for graduate students back when streaming was not easy to do. And after 2 years, Ellie sponsored me to do my MBA. And so I did my MBA here while I worked for Ellie. I'm not saying he's a slave driver, but while I did learn a whole lot about telecommunications policy, I became a leading expert in 13th Amendment jurisprudence. So I left Columbia. I got hired by Pepper, where my official title was MBA Secret Weapon number 1, which I still have on my desk. And basically, Pepper hired me to sort of work through some of the problems that Ellie had illuminated. How do we solve this? How do we solve this as a regulatory commission, as a regulatory agency? Can you create the freedom and innovation and low barriers to entry of unlicensed spectrum with the economic efficiency of licensed spectrum? Fast forward about 15 years later, yes, you can, and you can determine unlicensed allocations in the auction. And that's the last time I published on, that's my last academic a paper published about 15 years ago. So now I am the CEO of a software startup. The company is called Ozeki. We are building software to negotiate contracts. We don't call this AI. We think we're onto something else. We have created what we call artificial discretion, because you don't need a lot of intelligence to negotiate a contract, but discretion, yeah, that's actually really helpful. And in investor meetings, people ask me, what's my long-term vision for the company? And I say, well, we're starting with sales contracts because those are a lot of medium complexity, high deal flow. But if we get really, really good at this, we get very efficient at this, well, we can negotiate anything. So imagine for a second, you're a packet on the internet and you need to negotiate the most efficient way across the internet. Or you're a smart radio and you need to procure spectrum. Or, you know what, you just want to go to a website, you don't want to click confirm, drop all cookies. I can negotiate out with that privacy policy. You want to drop all cookies, it's 1995, have a good time. And the investors are all like, this is brilliant, where did you get all these ideas? And I never tell them. So that, I'd like to introduce my co-moderator.
Yes, my name is Heather Hudson. I've known Ellie not as long as most of you, but I'm from the same, or some of you, but from the same generation. And I will say briefly about Ken, when he described his new company to me, I thought, oh, that could be good for those of us who write books, although I haven't written as many or edited as many as Ellie. Book contracts are a real pain. And I see that your book doesn't have the disclosure that I've seen in the front of some others recently that says this content may not be used for training any AI services. True, it's written right in there. So next contract.
Don't worry, we're suing. I'm not joking.
Anyway, I want to say that I really have, as all of you have, appreciated Ellie's insights and his ideas, also his friendship and collaboration over many years and decades, a few decades now from my part, and give you a little context about my background, because I'm not sure I completely fit on this panel, but I'm an example, I guess, of some of the reconvergence of industry sectors. When I was in grad school at Stanford, it was all about mass media. there was no mention of telephony, telecom, interactive, anything. And it wasn't until I got a job hired as a consultant, actually, by the Canadian Department of Communications. I'm originally Canadian, which then became Industry Canada, which is now ISED, which is not progress, that I learned about the importance of communication, especially in remote areas, for interactivity. I was sent first to Labrador and then across the Canadian North. And everywhere we talked to Native people and people in remote communities, and they said, we want telephone service, or we want to be able to get help in an emergency, or stay in touch with our family studying or working in the city, or get back to that government person who came and promised us whatever, and we never heard from them again. So I thought, well, I think if I lived in a remote area too, that would be my first priority. Oh, and they said, yes, we want TV, but it was clearly not the first thing that leapt to their minds. And then I worked with Ed Parker, who some of you have mentioned as both a mentor and then a colleague. He unfortunately died in January after a very long and very productive and insightful career. But he sent me to Alaska, and we worked on research on telemedicine on an experimental satellite. But then Ed and some colleagues said, no, this is fine. We got good research. Here's what the implications are. But now we need to work on getting reliable communication, not on a NASA satellite, but on a commercial satellite to all the villages. And that introduced me to policy. So from policy to remote areas and developing regions and what became known as the digital divide. And I thought something I haven't heard people mention yet. In the 90s, do you remember NII and GII, information infrastructure? And then on to internet work. And I had heard about Ellie, read his material, and come to see him, and hear him, and talk to him at TPRC. But I also was very privileged to get a Sloan Industry Fellowship and spend some time at Columbia as part of one of the Sloan programs that the dean mentioned at the beginning. And one other thing that he encouraged me, although I don't think he ever said this directly, but by example, I then set up a telecom management and policy program in the business school at the University of San Francisco, because I thought that combining some telecom and technical knowledge with business and policy could lead to good careers and good research, and it worked very well. So I'm an emerita from USF as well. And I want to turn it over to hear from the newer and then older generations and their thoughts about Ellie and the issues on our panel. Thanks.
Thank you, Heather. So I'm Jason Buckweitz. I guess I'm the newer generation we'll go with. Interestingly enough, I'll even actually consider myself a little bit of the new generation Ken Carter. And in many ways, I followed in Ken's footsteps. I was also in law school, thankfully working for Ellie's wonderful wife, Nadine Strassen, at the time. And as I was getting ready to graduate, she recommended to me, have you met my husband, Ellie? He works on a lot of the same stuff that you're very interested in. So I was fortunate enough to have a meeting with Ellie and some discussions, and up came the idea of, hey, would you like to come and work at CITI? So I did start way back when. It now feels like ages ago. It's been 15 years, but started working at CITI as the assistant director, and then eventually the associate director, and now the executive director of CITI, which will be sad to see go, but 15 wonderful long years. And hopefully I can follow in your footsteps, Ken, of creating a successful startup. Now keep going with all of that.
First, my startup has to be successful, then you can follow.
I'm Ben Compaine. Where to start? First, a very generic comment. I publish a Substack called The Two-Sided Pancake every week. And something I think Ellie could write too, a two-sided pancake. I've never seen a pancake so thin it doesn't have two sides. And it just so happens this week's topic was the headline, "Give them their flowers while they're still around." And what I was discussing was going to people's memorials after they've died, and you hear wonderful things spoken about them, and you say, why couldn't the person hear them while they were still around to appreciate that? So I think it's wonderful that Nadine and Jason put this together, so while Ellie is still vigorous and around, he can see how many people he's touched in so many different ways. So that's generic. I did a book in 1979 called Who Owns the Media? And I thought it was pretty neat. We had a couple editions of it. And then Ellie comes along, and this is typical of everything we've heard today. He does a book called Who Owns the World's Media? I was just a little piece of that. And not only is it an exhaustive work, he, of course, broadened it to include platforms and the internet and telecom and things that were newer. But he also came up with an index. He tried to come up with an index that was more media-centric than an HHI standard index we've used. And it's a great contribution, and it's very typical of Ellie to take stuff that other folks have talked about. But in retrospect, I was a Class A minor league pitcher with an 85-mile-an-hour softball and a sort of a decent curve. And Ellie, I see as a major leaguer with a 95-mile-an-hour fastball and a cutter that Frisbee wouldn't be able to do. So whatever Ellie touches is a step above what I think other of us can do. I'll just leave it there for the moment, and maybe we'll get to more later.
Great. Thanks very much, Nadine and Ellie, for the opportunity. I'm Rob Frieden, Emeritus Professor of Telecommunications and Law at Penn State, just off the plane from Hawaii. And curiously enough, there are two of us who attended that conference in Hawaii, the Pacific Telecommunications Council, on the panel, and one more colleague in the group here as well, Dr. Pepper. And I got to tell you, I have not yet addressed the perfect remedy for jet lag, but the right honorable colleague over here seems to be impervious to jet lag. So bear with me if I falter a little bit. Furthermore, it was glorious in Hawaii. I called my wife and said, honey, it's 10 below here. It's 10 below 80. No color though. I was right at the conference. I'd like to just remind us of Ellie's role, particularly at the Telecommunications Policy Research Conference. I think that's when I met him first. At that time, it was in the Airlie House in Northern Virginia west of Fairfax, west of Dulles, almost to Warrenton. And it was a very small conference at the time. You really got the opportunity to mix it up with scholars. I was new to the process and really learned about interdisciplinarity, and Ellie really helped mentor me as I made a transition from a regulatory agency and private practice into academics. And his interdisciplinarity is an inspiration. He is someone who can mix it up with economists. Economists have no problem mixing it up with anybody, but he can mix it up with them and pursue empiricism and work against maybe some convenient theories. And one that comes to mind really blends what Ellie's been doing empirically and what some stakeholders would like to use to justify a merger or acquisition. It's called the rule of three. It's a little like prunes. Just how many do you need to have a competitive, robust market? And it's used often to justify a merger or acquisition under the scenario that it's going to promote competition. How does that airline competition, or consolidation rather, work for you? How does a merger of hospital and doctor chains and insurance companies and what work for you? So the rule of three is you only need three. Maybe you do in some situations. And here's the irony. Ellie would come up and his team would come up with a recognition that there are market limitations and maybe only 2.5 competitors are viable. I don't know how you measure a competitor less than one, but you have this sort of juxtaposition of empiricism, guys who know how to do the math, having to mix it up and having to sort of set the record straight when there's a statute that's ambiguous or a statute that's pretty clear, promoting competition. Does it cause anti-competitive practices? Does it promote monopolization or sustain it? And now a movement into rules, and rules become gospel, and gospel becomes case precedent. And before you know it, we have a Chicago school model that says, well, you don't really need to sort of interpret the statute. We'll do it for you, and we'll establish a new consumer welfare standard. Last but not least, that welfare standard might be challenged by someone like Ellie, and Ellie would then be reviled as a hipster economist, a hipster lawyer, masquerading as some sort of antitrust scholar. And I think that was damning with faint praise, because he truly is a hipster. He truly is an inspiration. Thank you.
All right, so let's do this. I think today is about looking back and looking forward and looking through the lens of CITI. And a lot of work has been done by Ellie and by the organization on market structure and competition. And let me start by asking, did we get what we wished for? Did we wish for the right things? I'm not smart enough to answer that question, so
We should ask the panel. I'm a moderator, but I will add a kind of footnote to that. Maybe I was thinking about a related issue to throw out, and I remember from learning in grad school as well as just popular media, Newton Minnow's comment about the vast wasteland. And that was the content. There's nothing stimulating really on television. It's a vast wasteland. So I was thinking the same thing. And at that time, it was 3 broadcast channels. Those were your choices. Now we have supposedly a vast abundance, but we also have new convergence, new ways of collapsing those major entities back into a few, but a different few. So I wondered if the panel could also think about those implications, which are related, I think, to Ken's question.
Actually, my topic in the two-sided pancake this week is unintended consequences, and be careful what you wish for. Because I think when you go back to the 1960s and 70s, I remember the FTC in the late 70s had a symposium in Washington, a 2-day symposium where they brought in economists and lawyers to talk about, is the media too concentrated? And a lot of the criticism, of course, was only 3 networks and the same game shows and stuff on the 3 networks, the same gatekeepers on the news. And what we wanted was more diversity and more choice. And when the regulation loosened a little to allow more networks to have O&O's stations, Rupert Murdoch came along in the late 80s and put together some third-rate stations and created the Fox network. And folks said, oh, a 4th network. And it turned out it went down market instead of up market, when the critics were hoping for some opera, some jazz, some stuff. And instead it went down market with Married with Children and stuff like that. And the same thing when CNN came along, Ted Turner, great thing. And then Murdoch said, I'm going to do another all-news network. And the critics said, what do we need this for? We already have an all-news network. And it turns out that he created an all-news network for a different market than what CNN had. And a lot of us are uneasy with Fox today, but if you wanted diversity, we got diversity. And of course, the internet and streaming, essentially be careful what you wish for, because now we're wringing our hands over how fractionalized we've become. But this is what we wanted, I suppose. And we're going to have to deal with it. But this is what the critics wanted. This is what Newton Minnow wanted in 1961, essentially, is more diversity. Here we are.
To that point, when I first got to CITI, one of the first tasks Ellie and I worked on together was a discussion on, at the time, the call for basically the a la carte cable, right? There was the whole push. We want to deregulate, open up cable, allow for user choice. It's going to be great. And so Ellie tasked me with trying to basically figure out how much is each channel costing? What are we paying? What is the average cable bill? All of that kind of information. Went and spent many sleepless nights, thank you, Ellie, for trying to figure out that information, and came back and said the worst idea possible is to go a la carte, because yes, sure, the person who doesn't want to pay for ESPN can finally get rid of the uber expensive ESPN, but the channels that they do watch are going to skyrocket in cost, and they have no idea what they're asking for. They're basically saying, give me this thing, it's going to be cheaper, not realizing that the economics just don't support it. So what ended up happening? Well, we went a la carte. Netflix, Hulu, what's the other ones now? Disney Plus, etc. You can choose which one you want. The only people that actually benefited from that is not you, me, it's the content owners, because now they're able to charge more and more. Netflix was $7.99 when we first started this discussion. Now what is it, $24.99? Why? Because the content operators can charge higher rates, which in turn they pass on to their consumers, and we don't have a choice. You're not paying for cable, you're just paying for the content that you used to get through cable for significantly cheaper. So to your point, be careful what you wish for. You got it. The cable companies are just making more money now and charging us more.
I'll stipulate that there are lies, damn lies, and statistics, okay? And we live in a marketplace of ideas. But if I asked Ellie, what's the market share of, I don't know, Nexstar? He could calculate it empirically, quantitatively. He could give me a number. And then I would say, well, does that exceed 39%, which is the standard established by the legislature, Congress? And he might tell me, sotto voce, well, of course. But then there are lies, damn lies, and statistics. How do you, for example, evaluate station ownership consolidation in the media? particularly when there are exceptions to the rule or conditional interpretations, some of which have passed their shelf life. For example, a UHF television station to this day qualifies for a 50% discount based on a long time past propagational limitation because of the higher frequency. And I talked about specificity in the law. You don't have specificity in the interpretation of the statute of what constitutes a relevant market geographically and whatnot. So the rule of three can justify a market acquisition. 39% is not exactly what 39% means. It might mean 89%, 92%, depending on what your math is. And again, I go back to the point that Ellie and Jason and others did the math without fear, ready to mix it up if somebody disputed it, but they did it empirically and they did it with integrity. We don't have that all the time now.
And Rob, to your point, Ellie and I are continuing the work that we did on Who Owns the World's Media with Carleton University up in Canada. And one of the long-standing discussions that we've had is the streaming video market. How exactly do you define that market? And the argument that we've had, congenially of course, is basically, do you include user-generated video in that market space? Does TikTok, Facebook, Google, YouTube, et cetera, are those players competing with Netflix, Hulu, et cetera? Because that completely changes the way that market looks. Is astronomical. Netflix goes from having something like 40% market share down to 10% market share if you let Facebook, Google in. If you ask a regulator, they go, oh, no, two different things, UGC and studio content. And the question that I ask as a person who uses all that stuff is, what's the difference? Right? Mr. Beast is a studio. He's user-generated content. He's got hundreds of millions of dollars behind him. He's generating content that has billions of views. How is he any different than Warner Brothers? He has a different name and he's a younger guy? That's the only explanation I can get.
So maybe this is a good point for me to bring. I don't know when the best time would be, but we often have the 10 largest, the 50 largest media companies. I thought I would bring in here, and to Jason's point about what is a media company, let me first ask, in 1986, just about roughly the time that CITI was getting started, what was the largest media company? Audience? Largest media company by revenue? World? No, US. Oh, CBS.
Yeah.
Second largest, capital cities, ABC. Newspaper company, broadcaster. Third, Time. Fourth, Dun & Bradstreet. Fifth, GE with NBC. And sixth, Warner Communications. All right, so that was 1986. I asked my research assistant today, his name is Claude, and I just asked Claude, I just gave it a very simple prompt. I asked Claude to go out, what are the 10 largest media companies by revenue today, 2024? Just with that prompt, this is what Claude came up with. Alphabet, YouTube, Meta, ByteDance, Comcast, Amazon, Disney, Microsoft, Warner Brothers Discovery, Paramount, and Netflix. So I went back to Claude. I said, go back out again and take out the pure platform companies, those like Google that really don't create content. And Claude came back with, and I haven't checked Claude. Claude doesn't always get it just right. So if we were working on a book, I'd want to check some of this. So Claude says number one now without platforms. Anyone? Comcast with NBC. This is actually 2024. Walt Disney, who was on that 1986 list. Amazon with Amazon Studios, and I don't know how they account for Prime Video revenue. Warner Brothers Discovery, Netflix, Paramount, Skydance, Fox, Sony, and sort of 10th place was Bertelsmann, maybe Lionsgate or News Corp. But anyway, the point is, there's always going to be a top 10. You have to define it. You're measuring, and it keeps changing. Some of those names from today didn't even exist in anyone's imagination in 1986, or the early days of CITI.
Just to follow up a micro-analysis. I live in State College, Pennsylvania, centrally located in the middle of nowhere. It's the 250th market, what have you. And I want to just juxtapose a micro-analysis. Sinclair owns a station, a network affiliate. Sinclair manages a second network affiliate. Sinclair manages a third network affiliate. Okay, who cares about State College, Altoona, Johnstown, PA? And I appreciate, depends on your market definition, but I got to tell you, when you have one station owner or one outfit, one corporate outfit owning a station and then managing two other network affiliates, you can say television doesn't matter and influencers are just as important as broadcast networks, but there ought to be some sort of guardrail or assessment whether that has some impact on that individual market and society in general and all of Central PA, if in fact you care about Central PA.
Hey, to follow up on some of these issues, I just wanted to make a contextual aside here about your study with Carleton. One of the issues in Canada has been for decades, and one of the reasons I think this work continues is Canadian content. First of all, what is Canadian produced content? We'll set that aside for now. But the second is, how much of it do we need? And then who should pay for it? Should all the networks that show content in cable and streaming contribute to a fund to support Canadian content? And then, as Jason added, what about other small producers? Where do they fit? If they produce Canadian content, does that show up somewhere as on that ledger, but they're too small to contribute? And I will say, this goes back, one of the first studies I did, and not knowing that it, as a lowly graduate student, it was worth trying to get published, was do Canadians watch American, how much American content do Canadians watch if they have a choice? And my market research then focused on one city that had US cable, Vancouver, which picked up all the US channels over the air, and another city at that time, Edmonton, that did not yet have cable, and they just had the Canadian network channels. And it turned out that Canadians would watch American entertainment any way they could get it. And at that time it was very limited. So obviously in Vancouver, they could watch it directly on American channels. In more remote communities, this time city of Edmonton, they watched Canadian or American content rebroadcast picked up by Canadian distributors, CBC and CTV. But they did watch Canadian news, no matter what channels there were, and some Canadian sports. So that kind of disrupts the notion of what's the importance of Canadian content? Should it be encouraged? And then how do you pay for it? 40 years later, it goes on. Coming back to disruption, I wanted to pose to the panel, we've heard about organizational, we certainly heard just from Ben about the new players and reshuffling of players and what could be considered media. But we've also heard about technological disruption. Organizationally, Ellie mentioned breakup of AT&T early on. We've had mobile, which Pepper mentioned, and which has been extremely disruptive in the developing world in a very positive way for users, because now with more innovative approaches to payment, people can have prepaid cell phones, which they top up whenever they can. There's still some issues with that, but I think it came about because there was a chance to, with a new technology, change the regulatory environment in many countries. And so new operators were able to convince regulators, no, this is not the same as your old PTT. You can have new rules now. And it wasn't only about how cheap installing cable, installing wireless was compared to stringing cable, and now we're back to fiber. More recently, LEO satellite service in many remote and even rural areas in North America and increasingly in the developing world has been very disruptive in a positive way for users, but challenging the business models of the incumbents and even new terrestrial operators. Right now, it's primarily Starlink, but in the future, we have Amazon Leo and the Chinese and who knows what. So I'm curious to get your perspective on, do you foresee either what kind of new disruptions do you foresee, or what impacts do you see recent disruptions having on the structure of the industry.
Yeah, I'll take first because one of the areas that I'm looking at is exactly that, is one of the major disruptions. And I think what truly is going to be a disruption, at least to the ISP market, which is probably one of the most backbone markets at this point in terms of where we look at the economy, since everything now runs over the internet, is fixed wireless. So I understand where Mr. Musk is going. He loves this idea of Starlink. It gives him control. It gives him power. That's great. It's really great for rural, but so is cell phones. And cellular technology, fixed wireless, is eminently faster, doesn't have the same issues in terms of latency that Starlink has and others have. And it's growing leaps and bounds on top of the fact of the cost is tremendously lower. I say this as somebody who is a fixed wireless customer. Why? Because it's $25 for unlimited internet, for 4G, 5G speed that gets 100 to 150 megs down and 25, 30 megs up for $25. Starlink for that same service is $120 and will cap you after a certain amount of usage. I can't compete at that rate. Wireless is growing. I think the last time I looked at it, it was about 15 million subscribers. That number doubled in a year. It's going to continue to double as Verizon and T-Mobile push in their own market. It's cannibalization of their own market, which I find interesting because they're basically trading their higher end fiber prices and their higher end ISP markets for this low cost wireless, but they're also trying to bring you over to, we'll give you the $25 wireless if you already have a wireless phone. So I think what they're trying to do is also grow their wireless network. But that to me is the major area because it will compete on satellite, it will compete on fixed line, and if you control the pipes, you control the discussion.
I have a confession to make. I'm a digital immigrant, and as such, some of this change and disruption is going to be perhaps more trouble to me than to a digital native. I'll give you an example. At the Chicago O'Hare Airport, I'm ready to fill out the notification to Agriculture Hawaii that I'm not bringing in plants or animals and whatnot. And lo and behold, the paper version is no longer there. You need to scan a QR code. And I've got a couple of minutes to ascend the learning curve and do it correctly and get an email confirming that I had made the report or I'm not boarding to the promised land, Hawaii. Okay, I look at something like Netflix acquiring Paramount and I wonder, is that the demise of theatrical display of movies? Is that the emphasis on streaming? Is that progress? Is that innovation? Similarly, not necessarily for this panel, we're seeing the demise, the retirement of landline service. It reminds me of the Negroponte flip expressed years ago. Is that progress or innovation? I would perhaps show my elder status in terms of a personal opinion, but suffice it to say that change is something you can't prevent. As to whether it's innovative and progressive, it depends on the eye of the beholder.
But Rob, I think what's also important is because I straddle that interesting timeline of being both a digital immigrant and a digital native. I was born in '85, so right at that crux of, well, and plus my father gave me the ability of, he was a CIO, did all the tech stuff. So I very early on, I had a 286 computer when I was 1.5 years old. So yeah, thanks, Dad. But what I look at it is also the digital immigrant mentality is also really helpful because it gives a warning, right? The digital natives are looking at progress is great. Everything's wonderful. Rip out those old copper wires. Let's put in fiber. That's great until you have a power outage, until you have a natural disaster. And then all of a sudden those systems don't work. What happened during Sandy? The copper lines worked. The other stuff failed. We have to think sometimes, hey, wait, take a second, take a step back. Is this progress for progress' sake, or is this a good progress? And I think sometimes it's like, hey, yeah, let's do this. Let's go all wireless until we have a problem where somebody decides to jam the wireless network and the entire network goes down, or you have a disruption like last week and suddenly everybody's phone is in SOS mode and you can't talk to anyone and your internet doesn't work and all of that. The job of regulators is to think about where there's problems, where there's pinch points. And I think when it's just, hey, yeah, let's do it, it's great, we need that mentality of somebody saying, hey, wait a second, I was there before all of this, let me tell you what could go wrong.
Well, two things that Heather mentioned. First, there will be technological disruption. We don't know how it will play out. And I take a couple lessons from history. One is in the 1980s, a company called Predicast was asked to do a market study and try to figure out the future of home video. At the time, we had VCRs, and video discs were just coming along with RCA and coming out. And they did a study that predicted the penetration of home video in 1990 that was almost spot on. The problem was they had predicted that video disc would take over from VCRs because much easier to use, you could have pre-recorded stuff, and they had all this justification that turned out to be totally wrong, that VCRs disappeared, video disc, DVDs took over. So if you were making your bet as a manufacturer or seller and you put all your money into the VCR business, you would have been in trouble. So we don't know. The other thing about VCRs in the 1980s, I don't know if you realized that they were adopted faster in Europe than in the US, particularly the increase in stores that rented videos. In the US, it was primarily initially as a time-shifting device, and content came later. And my research, I did a little bit of research before Claude and had to ask people, and found out that in Europe, where TV was much more heavily regulated with BBC or the government ownership and programming, that the TV viewers in Europe were hungry to get the kind of content that Heather was just talking about for the Canadians, being able to be their own programmer and being able to start renting movies and things, even if it was in their own language, but renting what they wanted to see on television rather than what the government authorities told them they wanted to see. So all this tells me that there will be disruption, but predicting is a hazardous occupation, especially when it deals with the future. So I step back from deciding exactly how that will look.
Let me ask you to prognosticate. In the 10 years after I left CITI, I worked with the FCC, BNetzA, DG8, even SOMA, managing competition and monopolies. Then I went to work for companies like Google, protecting monopolies. And now I'm an entrepreneur, I'm interested in the establishment. So let's cast our view into the future. And what does the structure of AI markets look like? Does the technology change anything? Does the rule of 2.5, 3 stand up? What's into the next digital generation?
So I wanted to see if anybody else wanted to speak, because unfortunately this is what is keeping me up at night.
And maybe you can speak to your lawsuit. I think that's really interesting too.
That I can talk about too. But no, one of the areas that I've been looking at is basically market concentration and power of the AIs. And where it gets really interesting is looking into exactly that discussion, because yes, you have to also, again, go back to the discussion of how do you define the definition? What are we talking about? Are we talking about large language models? What are those being trained off of, based off of? If you dig into the LLMs, where are they training this information from? They're training it from Ellie's books. I'm not joking. We found, what did I say, 75 of your books were in the Anthropic lawsuit? Something like that? Yes. So yeah. So a lot of his work, my work, Nadine's work, all ended up into those training models. What does that mean? Well, it also means that we have to look at the book markets, the publishing markets. How concentrated are those markets? Because that's what's being used to train these AIs. And what that also means is the thought process going into these artificial intelligence models are being curtailed by how the market is defined. If you have 3 players, 4 players, 5 players deciding what is being published, where that information is coming from, what that information is, then the AI's knowledge base is controlled by that market share. As you continue that, if you say, hey, Sora, which is OpenAI's image generation system, what are you being trained off of? Oh, well, you just signed $1 billion contract with Disney to have Disney train all of your information. Well, what exactly does that mean? What does Disney's source material look like? Well, what time period of Disney? Does it mean that somebody's parent is about to die in every Sora video because that's what Disney decided it wanted to do in every single one of its videos growing up? Thanks, Mom and Dad, for traumatizing me for years. Bambi and all that stuff. Yeah, this is exactly that. You've got that very concentrated system of what these AIs are being trained off of, which then determines what the AIs decide and how the AI is built. What does that then lead to? Well, I think you're going to open up to a very competitive market for a few years where everyone and their brother is going to offer their own AI. There's Google's AI, there's Facebook's AI, there's OpenAI, there's closed AI, there's Claude, your friend. so on and so forth. But the market will not be able to sustain that many competitors. And the best way to look at that is look at the streaming video market right now. Everybody was calling for this. Everybody wanted it. You have at least 15 competitors that I can think of. What's happening? Massive amounts of concentration. Netflix is trying to buy Warner Brothers. Paramount is trying to buy Warner Brothers. Paramount just got bought by Skydance. NBC looks like it's not sustainable in the streaming. They're looking to sell off their assets. They're probably going to start selling off some of that stuff from Comcast. The market can't sustain. We can't afford the rents. OpenAI right now is being run on the regress of Microsoft, for lack of a better term. I don't see how 5, 6, 7 players are going to be able to burn the kind of money that is necessary to run the training modules and to run the electronics to run AI when there's not much of an appetite for payment. How much do you want to spend to generate janky videos on Sora? It's free right now, so it's fun to, oh, look at that. It's a cute video of a penguin eating another dog or something. I don't know, whatever people use Sora for. But how many people are going to use it when it costs $50? How many people are going to use it when it costs $100? The market demand is going to dry up. And you're going to immediately retreat back to probably 2.5 players, to Ellie's point originally of the market can probably sustain about 2.5 players.
I won't argue with that. I don't want to argue with Jason. I'm not sure how many big players there will. I just do see a tremendous impact on content creation from AI. We're in version maybe 1.0, maybe it's 0.8 still of where AI is. And we've already seen these models that can create videos, pretty competent videos, and certainly graphics. And I suspect that with all these data centers being built everywhere, you're going to feed into it every movie made for all time, including home movies, and then a prompt, who's going to be creating movies? You're going to have, I suspect, the capability to create a full action comedy, rom-com, action, Western, whatever you want, with very look-like actors out there. And I don't know who's going to be providing those and how those are going to be marketed and who those are going to be. But I just see our imagination yet hasn't figured out how disruptive that's going to be.
So, spoiler alert, the books that are sitting up here in the front, which I encourage everyone to take a copy at the lunch or at the end of the day, that Ellie has written and is just published, does have a section of the book that talks about exactly that. It's Video 2040, this imaginative, immersive, creative video. And one of the areas that he talks about in there is a whole discussion on what is the cost of all of this, right? How much is this going to cost to get to that level that you're talking about? And the cost is doable, but quite high. And when we calculated that, we were using current electric rates. But what we probably should have done, and maybe we'll do this, Ellie, for the second version that we publish, Video 2080, let's do it. But is what is the increase in cost to electrical utility rates as we keep building all of these data centers that you just mentioned, right? The data centers are coming, it's using up more and more electricity, and every electric utility is raising rates through the roof, citing exactly that reason. Well, we got to generate more electricity, so it's going to cost more. If we basically ramp up that cost even more, the numbers that Ellie came up with, which were doable but high for that user-generated immersive video, are going to jump even higher under that. So I implore everybody, please read the book. It's really good.
I think it's really important to look at prior models and ask yourself, is it different? This time it's different. This time it's different. Maybe not. I recall a declaration of cyber independence at the onset of the internet, and we seem to go through cycles. The past is the prologue. History repeats itself, perhaps, irrational exuberance leading to irrational pessimism, and then a sort of stasis or change. So I'd be in the slow go camp. And if that makes me an enemy of progress, guilty as charged.
All right, with that, we've got about 5 minutes left. What I'd like to do is open it up for questions and comments. There's no one in this room who couldn't actually be on this panel. So if you have a comment,
And
I'll
that would be
go
awesome.
around the room.
Thank you.
So if you have a comment, please, or counterpoint, please make it. Just don't disguise it as a question.
From the cheap seats.
Hi, Dave Burstein. I write about some of these things. As I was hearing the list from Jason before about all the giant companies, I didn't hear so much about the Chinese companies that are holding their own just fine. And one of the biggest issues is who's going to run this artificial intelligence, how much of it's going to be in places like Africa and South Asia and so on. And I wanted to open you up for ideas about how this is going to work out in other parts of the world.
Yeah, just really briefly on the issue of where the content comes from for LLMs, not for everything they do. Yes, some stuff will be licensed. I'd call that artisanal content. And then the rest is available for free. And I think that's going to be a much larger part of it, for better or worse, because the vendors are resistant to paying for it. So
I'll
I'm not
just
sure it's
say-
going to be that limited.
I'll just put my IP lawyer hat on for a second. It's never free. We own the rights to it, and we're going to be suing. No, I know. Yeah, I know.
So it's Mark McCarthy with Georgetown and Brookings. There's a question basically for Jason on the AI energy issue. How do you think we should protect the ordinary ratepayer from paying the bills for the AI data centers?
We can talk at lunch.
Okay.
I will say that the CPUC in California is trying to tackle that and that the conference I was just at, which was heavily industry related, the industry was mostly data centers and electricity for data centers. How many of those can we support? As Ken pointed out, where is the consolidation that's likely to happen or not?
Yeah, hi, Henning Schultz. Any quick comment, a question on the media side. I did not hear any mention of public media. And given for the attempts for local news, that basically the only hope for local news is nonprofit, public, whatever you want to call it, type of media. I wonder what role, if any, that's going to play, broadly speaking, or if it's always going to be aspirational.
Public media, this is something Bob Pepper worked on very early. This is where he started, I think. Maybe you should answer this. You know, one school of thought is that public media started when there wasn't much variety, when the three networks and most radio was all mass market, and there was need for something that wasn't so market oriented, and public radio filled that role. One argument today that I've heard is that we now have all that stuff covered in the marketplace, so public media maybe isn't as necessary. Now, there are arguments where you can come back at that, but the fact is it was started because certain niche things weren't covered, that it had 2% of the market, and that was fine. But now there's essentially everything is covered, and how important is it? So that's for another day.
Yeah, I'll respond to that in half a second. The short answer is AI and Twitter. That's where local media is going.
Disagree.
That's fine.
All right. The most important thing that I learned in all of my CITI conferences is the only thing worse than standing between people and lunch is standing between people and cocktails. So let's get lunch.
Here.